Mystery and Deceit, From Earth to Mars, Book 1 of Chaos's Orbit Saga, written by James T. Hall, narrated by Chris Pullman. Episode 6, How We Met, Part 1. Since you're back, I take it Amid confirmed what I gave you was old enough, Eric began as I was getting settled. He handed me a glass of water as he sat across from me. Pausing, I said, "How did you know I would end up taking them to Amid?" "Only man in this region with the expertise to do the testing," came the reply. "Don't worry. There's no way I would have tampered with the results." He sipped his own water, setting it beside him. I pulled the birth certificate and photo out of my bag, intending to hand them over. "No," Eric held up a hand. "You keep those. They'll do you more good than they will me at this point. And anyway, the government's propaganda on the matter just about has me believing that I don't really exist." He chuckled. Taking out my note tab, after replacing the certificate and photo, I set it to record and said, "Well, you don't mind if I record our conversations, do you?" "Not at all. I, Eric Pullman, consent to have my conversations with James Hall recorded and used by James Hall as he sees fit." "Good enough?" Eric asked with a smile. "Yeah, that should do," I replied nervously. "Relax, Sonny. You look more tense than a man that's been constipated for 4 days." Right. "Greg," I began, still not being used to using the man's real name. "Eric," he corrected. "Right," I said. "Eric, it's just a little hard to believe that you are who you're claiming to be. I mean, it's been almost 500 years since the TDF was forced off Earth. Even with today's medical advances, humans don't live much past a century and a quarter at most." "That's true," Eric said, leaning back and steepling his fingers. "I agree that I have no right to still be alive, nor to look as good as I do, so to speak. More on that later, though. And yet," spreading his hands wide, "here I am. What does your gut tell you about me, James? Not what do you want to believe, but what is your gut telling you?" "My gut is telling me that to be in possession of such artifacts as you gave me, and to bear such a striking resemblance to the man in the photo, despite my disbelief, you must be Eric Aaron Pullman, hero of Thermopylae, savior of North America, leader of the TDF, and friend of other TDF greats." Eric's demeanor changed somewhat during my listing. "I've been called many things, as you say. Hero among them." He looked at me over his once again steepled fingers. "But many a military man will tell you that heroes aren't the ones who live on. They're the ones left behind, in the ground. No, I only ever did my duty to humanity and my fellow troopers as best I could. As I already said to you, I'm not a hero. I'm not a hero. But," his demeanor brightening, "I am, or rather was, I suppose, friend to those others of the TDF leadership, as you say. Though out of them all, James Christopher and I were the closest friends." "So when did you two first meet? Was it at the project?" I asked. "Actually, quite a bit before Project Plymouth. The military general in charge of the project came to me and asked for recommendations for a civilian project lead. Having known James for some years, I suggested him. Within a week, he was on board and helping to recruit the best minds of the day." "So when was the first time you two met?" I prodded. "4th grade," Eric replied. "Mid-primary school these days. Amazingly enough, I didn't actually want to be friends with him at first." Eric began a recitation. "By 1st grade, I knew James as typical schoolboys knew each other, of course, classmates. At the time, everyone was equal. By 3rd grade, we unconsciously started to form groups, cliques. Somehow I maintained my own neutrality through the time. James was not so lucky. By 3rd grade, he was becoming an outcast. My mother actually made me invite James over to play one day. I knew almost immediately, though, that we would be the best of friends. You see, both James and I early on were fans of science fiction. He, Star Wars, and I, Star Trek. We always dreamed of what could be. When we'd have sleepovers, we would hypothesize, naively of course, about such things as light travel, force, and so on. It was a great time. We would hang out at recess, go to band together, things friends of that age do. By high school, that'd be secondary school, our roles began to reverse in ways. James remained an intellectual, taking advanced chemistry, biology, and mathematics courses, but he also joined the ranks of the jocks, athletes. I also took advanced coursework, our schedules at school crossing every so often, but I remained the aloof student I had ever been. I further spread out my studies, becoming in ways more well-rounded than James. I still think I worked harder in school than he ever did. He always seemed to come to concepts easier, understanding them faster and deeper than other kids our age. Me? I struggled. In the long run, I think it helped me during and after the Project Plymouth days. I was able to focus almost single-mindedly on something until it yielded its secrets to me. Knowing that we too are largely seen as the main drivers behind Atmo, and then the TDF, a friend of ours was as instrumental as were we, Adam Green. Where we specialized in biochemical studies, he was an engineer. Core courses in high school he took with us, but focused more on tech such as metalwork, fabrication, etc. He proved indispensable at Atmo. When we graduated, we all continued on to post-secondary schools where we furthered our passions. James started at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and finished his collegiate work at Madison prior to being brought on board for the project. I, meanwhile, did my undergrad studies at UW Green Bay before continuing on to graduate work and research at MIT. Adam attended solely the Milwaukee School of Engineering, specializing in advanced robotics and propulsion for both his thesis and dissertation. We brought him onto the project early as a subhead in vehicle research and development. I remained as a subhead for physics, one of my several specialties. Another member of the leadership in the program was Melinda Vista, whom James eventually married. We brought in various other MS and PhD civilians to assist in the technical phases of Project Plymouth. Largely, military participation was kept to a security level, as well as test subjects. The various project heads were given military commissions on bequest of General Lathrop, the military lead, as he felt it would put his men and women more at ease while working with us. We harbored no illusions. We knew we were putting people's lives on the line with our work. Theory, after all, can only take you so far before it must be tested in reality. But everyone at that time felt it was worth the risk. The coalition wars had taken a bad turn for the Allied nations, and the coalition nations made no secret of their plans for the world after conquest. Dictated order under strict theocratic law. Research was to be stymied, technological advancement halted. We were set to do whatever was necessary to stop such an agenda. We worked on the project for years, coming closer and closer to creating the super soldiers the Allies wanted so desperately. Then the coalition collapsed internally when its leader died. That's something that never really made the history books, just how important one man could be in societies over there. The geography of the Middle East is fairly flat. Conquerors for centuries would just sweep across the open landscape, stopping only when they hit a body of water or large mountain range like the Himalayas. The thing that held such empires together and that imprinted itself on the base culture there was strongmen. In anthropological terms, the strongman is exactly what it sounds like. A strong leader, men in those times, with a will of such size as to rigidly impose his desires on those beneath him and keep them in check. From the great Persian Empire through the time of the Ottoman Empire, this could be seen in grand scale. During the 20th century, though, it was seen in microcosm. Every nation that sprang up, with few exceptions, was ruled essentially by one man with an iron fist. Early in the 21st century, people there had finally had enough of these rulers and so overthrew most of them in what was termed the Arab Spring. The only problem was that it removed all the small, local strongmen, leaving a vacuum of power. Shiite turned against Sunni, Arab against Kurd, tribe against tribe. Then all at once a leader stepped up and offered order. Peace. People across the region flooded to him. He used his charisma and newfound popularity to unite the Arab world under one banner, one he used to declare war on Israel. The West, being tied by treaty to Israel, had to respond, and so the coalition war began. It ended much the way it had started, though. The Arab leader suffered a massive and fatal stroke. Without his leadership, the various factions he had united in cause splintered and again turned against each other almost overnight. The war was over for the West. They left peacekeepers in Israel to protect its sovereignty, of course, but disengaged from major combat operations and cut back on wartime expenditures. Our project lost its priority status. We could feel the prize, that which we worked and sacrificed for, was just within our grasp, but being slowly pulled away. So, prior to our funding being cut completely, we quickly pulled all our work together, creating hasty labyrinthine formulas and procedures for final nanitic integration, and tested them all together. Once. Shooting for shit, we brought in a squad of Marines on who to attempt the integration. We dismissed the lower-level civilians and left only the nanite lab guards on duty within the facility. Knowing the enormous risk we were taking, we didn't want to endanger any unnecessary lives or careers. In hindsight, we were young and foolish. The war was over, but our pride pushed us onward. We had met with more success than failure over the long term, and so became overconfident and reckless. We pushed the general, assuring him our process would be successful and safe, so he gave us the green light. Those of us left worked double and triple shifts, back to back, to get everything ready for one final attempt. We figured that if we could get the nanites to work, we could get refunded. The tech held such promise, almost limitless. We pushed, always. Whenever a test came up negative, we boosted levels. Pressure, chemical slurry density, nanite parts per million coefficient, power were all increased to such high levels that any sane scientist would have found error. But we were too blinded by our ultimate goal. We lost our objectivity, and so we pressed on. Finally, we received notice that our facility, Project Plymouth in its entirety, was being shut down and shelved indefinitely. I can't blame the politicians who made the decisions. We had failed so far to deliver as promised. Knowing the end was near, we took imperfect calculations and guesses and decided to try them. The Human Integration Lab, hastily built, was brought online. Some of the power shielding had yet to be fully installed, and we used substandard pipes when requisitions for the proper ones were refused. It was a situation built to fail. But again, we pressed on. After so much theoretical work, we finally brought in the Marines, hooked them into their womb chambers, and sedated them. Slowly, we began filling the tanks with chemical reagents, ionizing the mixture as we went, testing the conditions we were creating. The tests looked good, so we kept going. We increased the power, pressure, and chemical levels, literally forcing our nanites into the very cells of the Marines. They were submerged in enclosed chemical baths. We could see the pain they underwent in their jerks and spasms. Even sedated, a few came through, opened their eyes, scratched at the insides of the tanks containing them, looking for any way out of the pain. They screamed. Raw pain. Indiscernible as anything linguistic or comprehensible. Through the chemicals, through the transparent metal tubes, their screams came. We pushed on, forcing more power, more of the chemical bath, and more of the nanite slush into the tanks. Tanks themselves had been designed to withstand many atmospheres of pressure, so they were in no danger of rupturing. The rest of the equipment, however, was not tested at the loads we were incurring. We hadn't the right parts. Cracks began forming in the pipes, leading from our storage tanks to the pumps, from the pumps to the wombs where the Marines were. Gas alarms began to sound. The chemicals were vaporizing, leaking through the seals. We didn't stop. We were so close, only seconds away from finishing. With the chemical catalyst at full concentration and the nanite slurry injected in the tanks, all we needed to do was polarize the Marines' tanks to force molecular bonding on the base nanites. We engaged the conductors. There was a spark. The escaping gases ignited, the flame flowing back into the storage tanks. We scrambled to stop the chain reaction. We knew it was about to occur. If the fire reached the chemicals in the storage tanks, they would ignite, causing a tremendous explosion, such that would tear open the slurry tanks and release all the nanites. Being pre-programmed, the nanites would activate in the presence of sufficient energy, bonding where they could and seeking access to more power where they couldn't. They could compromise the containment of our high-yield power lines. There could be secondary explosions, the entire base blown up by the combination of dangerous chemicals and raw power that we were about to mix. General Lathrop snapped to action, jumping across catwalks in the Marines' tanks to get to the manual shut-off valve for the chemical feed line. He got there, but a moment too late. The ignition had reached the tanks. Time seemed to suddenly stop. The tanks bulged at first, then the pipes. Rivets and bolts popped. Flames came out of joints in the line. The pipe in front of the general burst. He had such a strangely surprised look on his face as he was thrown back and to his left. heat. Intense heat. The flame reached the exploding chemical cloud and it ignited. The general was consumed mid-air. A concussion wave swept us all from our feet. I saw the Nanite slurry tank cracking along its height as I was tossed to the ground. Rending metal and liquid flow met my ears, coolness washing over me like a wave. Emergency protocols took effect and cracked the Marines' tanks, throwing their occupants onto the floor as well. We scientists got up first, drenched and throwing up the slurry. The Marines were awake, the pain proving more powerful than the sedatives, and were writhing on the floor. I looked around at our lab. Twisted metal, burst tanks, and scorched walls greeted my gaze. In one corner fluttered to the ground, still burning remnants of a computerized camouflage uniform. Spotting a power conduit near the slurry tanks, I saw the nanites eating their way through the insulation. James and I locked gaze and nodded in agreement. "Everyone out," he called, while I made my way to the closest wall panel, entering the code for emergency evacuation. We and the lab guards helped the Marines to their feet and started getting out when finally the nanites ate through the power conduits. The final component of nanite bonding was coursing through the chemical slurry bath, flowing around our feet and into us. That feeling of total paralysis and utter helplessness was so incredibly angering and humbling all at once. All of us seized up where we stood, falling to the ground atop control desks, chairs, and each other, our bodies racked with electrically induced muscle spasms. If you've never been electrocuted, it's like having worms crawling around your central nervous system, wreaking havoc with your mind as they go. You can feel waves of movement surge through your limbs, up your torso, through your heart until it enters your brain. It makes it feel like it'll explode. Another feeling accompanied this one, nearly as unpleasant. Cold about my feet started to creep along the rest of my body. It was as if I was slowly being immersed in a vat of ice water. Seconds seemed like minutes, minutes as hours, and wave after wave of electrical energy washed through my body, and I sank further and further into that icy darkness. The cold enveloped me, cresting my head and coating my lungs. I couldn't breathe. Then, all at once, the waves of pain and agony stopped. I crumpled onto the ground, my body a mass of lead. Slowly I crawled to my knees, grasping the edge of the table I had fallen on, and pulled myself to my feet. Melinda was closest to me. She, as I had just begun to recover. I looked around and saw that, with the exception of the Marines, all of us were coming around. The Marines, however, were still somehow being racked with shocks. I ran to the power switch master panel and threw the breaker, shutting off power in the whole lab. I thought it so strange that I could do so even as others were yet being affected. We were in total darkness then, save the light from the hallway sweeping in through the lab doors' windows. Someone stumbled toward them and thrust one open. We helped the Marines to their feet and guided them up the stairwell to the surface. Emergency personnel were just arriving as we breached the outer doors into the cool Wisconsin October evening. Once the soldier in charge of the base guard was told what happened, he put it on immediate lockdown and quarantine. All of us, civilians and lab guards, were cleared medically, but were placed under observation in one of the base's barracks. The Marines were quarantined in another. They remained in critical condition for a few days. The day after the accident, we were part of the initial on-site team to investigate the lab. After only a few minutes, though, we were pulled out. Everything had been destroyed. All our data, our research notes from the lab, even the nanite base units we had used to create the slurry. The chemicals, after being in contact with atmosphere overnight, had turned corrosive and chemically eaten away what the nanites hadn't. The whole underground complex smelled of electrical fire and chemical burn. Mystery and Deceit, From Earth to Mars, Book 1 of Chaos's Orbit Saga. Written by James T. Hall, narrated by Chris Pullman. Episode 6, How We Met, Part 1. Visit us online at www.narclaninc.com to link up with us.